Yeah, but why is the wrong camera?
Can I try something?
Yeah. Maybe I should disconnect and reconnect the Zoom camera. Yeah.
Yeah, you might want to do that because it's not showing up as an option for what camera you're using.
That's actually not my department. Everything is my department. Oh.
Well, that would do it.
There you go. As simple as that.
All right.
At least we got rid of some of them. All right. Very good. Oh, look. Is that your friend?
I don't know this.
Hi. Right. So you'll be talking to this mic if you can.
Yep.
You just have to turn it on.
Offering.
And then when they're, because then people, but then now they see it's got turned on. You know? Okay. Disconnect. All right. Let me.
Make sure that presentation.
Okay. So
Do you have access to the Tender email?
you know, you have like your own number. We're getting there.
Someone plays the piano. Oh.
The piano. Really? Ever since the sixties.
So.
It's tightly packed.
Good.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yes. It's the microphone
It's the microphone. Okay.
and the Zoom. So we're gonna.
No, it should be good. I just couldn't wedge it in when it was surrounded on both sides.
I think you just destroyed the owl, but do you want to try to put it on and then take it out? And then we'll put it the other one in the other place.
I mean, it would be good. The owl eventually, it just needs to turn itself on.
We're almost ready, guys. I would like to take this happy opportunity to eat my own bagel. That's my version of a bagel. And while I do that, to share with you that I'd be more than happy if any of you would be willing to take up the task of becoming techie assistants of All of the Bagel, because I'm not always able to come here early, and this will happen when things go wrong. So if there are any of you who are willing, it's really not rocket science. You just have to know the system. Those of you who frequent here often are, I'll be glad to give you the explanation myself, as well as our office, but their office isn't here on Sunday morning, right? So there will never be. So that could be a very helpful thing. It doesn't take a rabbinic degree to know how to operate. In fact,
This is rocket science.
yeah, in fact, Zoom just fixed itself. Yeah, but it's Hamish. So no, I just try to be respectful of people's time, and I know that people come here to learn and study. Having said that, I'm very happy to see all of you here this morning. I see some people that I see here often. I see some people that I maybe like the topic or the lecturer, and I'm glad that you're here. As you know, Hall of the Bagel is a cultural, intellectual salon where we try to bring a variety of topics, but in a very broad way, are interesting to our identity, to our intellectual curiosity, and to who we are as a community. And our speaker today, remind me your name, please.
James Sheinbaum.
James Sheinbaum, yeah, right. When actually Hannah, who worked here last year, suggested that you will come, I said this falls right down our alley, because she said, I have a friend who is interested in the subject of transgenerational trauma, and I think that any nation, and also the Jews, have their fair share of that. I don't know. It's not a competition, so I wouldn't say us more than others or less or no, but I wish it were less. Maybe it's more. I don't know. So I want to say that others don't have problems. Everybody does. So I think maybe to understand many of the things that we're facing today as individuals, as a collective, this topic we might find very interesting, and you will talk more about yourself, and I'm really, is all the technical stuff, oh,
It should
are we
be.
able to share screen? for
Yeah,
that? Okay,
the screen is shared on
On Zoom?
Zoom with everyone.
You see, you have to get people who are younger than you, they'll get the technology faster, that's for sure. So thank you.
Should be good.
All right,
Yeah.
so people in Zoom, can you hear us? Oh, they're all muted, but well, they should, because they're on Zoom and they can hear.
Yes,
All right,
yes, hear you.
so may we all have a wonderful lecture, and I want to take more of your time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you
And
for
thank
having
you
me.
all for being.
So I've been instructed to talk into this mic. However, I also know that the computer's mic itself can pick me up. If I turn the mic off, can you hear me? Because I worry that I'm gonna spin myself around and the mic and fall over like a
People on
dog.
Zoom, ask the
Yeah.
people on Zoom.
Zoom people, can you hear me if I'm projecting like this?
Yes.
Perfect, okay. Then I'm gonna make sure I don't trip and fall in front of all of you today. Morning all, I'm James Sheinbaum. I'm here to present on empiricism and Jewish experience, which are two lenses that I'm going to use to try to understand intergenerational trauma, which is a topic that is really important to many of us in this room, but it's also a topic that I think is going to be illustrated as something that's important for all cultures and all groups throughout the world. And the main question that I'm trying to answer today is, what is intergenerational trauma? But I think that there's a more important question that's on your minds today, which is, who is this guy? So, I have a BA in clinical psychology. I graduated from the University of Rochester 2-ish years ago. And since then, I've worked with traumatized and high needs children. I've done research in depression and child maltreatment. And since then, I've moved on to a role in East Irondequoit as a community schools coordinator, which is helping assist that district with their anti-poverty strategy. But alongside that, and the reason that I'm here today in the temple, is that I'm also Jewish, and I am not just Jewish, but I love studying Judaism. So I was a Take 5 scholar during my undergraduate at the University of Rochester in Abrahamic religions, which means I got an additional 3 year to study whatever I wanted, and what I wanted to study was Abrahamic religions and that history and social development there. On top of that, I'm also a 6th grade and high school teacher at Temple Bethel. And so with all of these little bits and bobs about my personal history in mind, I think the important thing to note is the different elements of my lens that I'm going to be using today. My lens I would describe as empirical. I'm focused on scientific data from peer-reviewed research. I'm also trauma-informed. I'm aware that everyone is coming into the room carrying their own trauma and baggage, and that we're going to be talking about a lot of trauma and baggage today. So if there's anything that we're talking about that's a little bit too heavy for you today, I don't think there should be, but if there is, please feel free to make space for yourself and leave quietly and take a breather if that's what you need. On top of that, I'm community minded, both Jewish community, the neighborhood that I live in, the school district that I work for, all of these are communities that I'm focused on. In mind of that, I don't want this to just be a lecture. There's a discussion element. I want there to be time for questions. Please feel free to raise a hand if you have any confusions. And then finally, Jewish historiographical. I'm interested in not just the practice of Judaism, but how we understand Jewish history. And so I'll be talking today not just about Judaism as we understand it, but Judaism as it existed in the past. And now I'm going to ask you all, what is intergenerational trauma? Because I want to kind of gauge the knowledge in the room. So does anyone have any ideas to shout out? Shoot.
When one generation projects their anxiety and worry on the next generation, and the second generation bring the worry.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts? Yes.
It's also biological.
Mhm.
There's evidence that DNA can pass trauma from one generation to another.
Absolutely.
This may be slightly outside the definition, but my guess would be
if you have a parent who is badly traumatized, they may manage to traumatize you in not in just passing on their trauma, but simply suffering through having a parent that is not able to complete their duties properly.
So the themes that I'm hearing are trauma getting passed on between generations. There's biological elements to that, and then there's this sort of social or interpersonal re-traumatizing element to it. And you're all right on the money. That's exactly how I'm going to be approaching it today. Trauma symptoms get experienced by later generations. That's the most basic definition of it. However, there's two questions that need to be asked of this that are being begged by that element. What elements of trauma can be transferred? Is it the whole shebang, or are certain parts of trauma not able to be moved between generations? And how are they transferred? So biological is one part of that, and then the social stuff is one part of that, and I'm going to dive into that. To start off, I'm going to talk about those elements of trauma that can be transferred between generations. So, to start off, we need to understand what trauma is at all. Trauma, or in particular, a trauma response, is what a lot of you are feeling right now when I show this picture. For many of us, we remember where we were and how we found out the news about the attacks on September 11th. Some of us might have even been in New York City or in Arlington, and some of us may have even known people who were lost in the attacks. I use this because it helps us feel internally what a trauma response is, which is just a reaction to a disturbing experience. Anything that is unsettling us and moving us away from that sort of happy and healthy baseline is what is a trauma. The response to it is where we move from a sort of just the immediate distressing response into what can become unhealthy. These symptoms of trauma or post-traumatic stress. So that includes distressing thoughts, inappropriate feelings, and fearful reactions, which is sort of a lot of what we see when we think about PTSD, but it also includes risk of ill health. And I don't just mean ill mental health or psychopathology. I also mean poor physical health. There's data that shows that just seeing the attacks on September 11th, for example, have poor effects on our health. People have cardiac issues from knowing someone who was lost in the attacks, not just from being there themselves. So, with that in mind, slightly different definition for you. Intergenerational trauma is an offspring's trauma response to an experience of a prior generation. Not something that they experienced, but that someone else experienced, and they're feeling the response. The problem with it is that that doesn't happen to everybody. I use Auschwitz here to try to illustrate that not every trauma symptom is transferred to a victim's children. Namely, a lot of the physical trauma that's experienced in concentration camps was not experienced by concentration camp survivors, or by their, the survivors' children. However, it's also important to note that even among different families of survivors, there's different rates of resilience. Some people are more able to process their thoughts and feelings about that event than others. And even within a family, different children have different reactions. So trying to understand intergenerational trauma from a scientific perspective can be really difficult because not everyone is feeling the same way about everything, and not everyone experiences the same type of response. So it takes a lot of work to try to understand what behaviors and what symptoms are coming from a trauma response and what's coming from elsewhere, from other elements in our life. So moving on, what we see that is a transferable trauma symptom, stuff that we consistently see passed from parent to child to grandchild, begins with interpersonal deficits. This is where the research kind of began. In particular, by studying children of Vietnam veterans, they were able to find that there was a high rate of unhealthy family functioning. So what does that mean? It means low effective responsiveness, so that inappropriate emotional reaction that I was talking about. It also means low problem solving. If I'm a veteran and I have a spouse and we're arguing about something, we might not be able to come to a solution because of that low aptitude for problem solving. And that causes problems in families that spirals out into future generations. Furthermore, we see that risk of illness is something that can be carried between generations. So mental illness like depression and anxiety, but also that's sort of the internalizing stuff. There's also externalizing stuff, increased aggression and substance use and impulsivity that we see in children of veterans. So the whole kit and caboodle of mental illness is something that can be passed on. And like I said, negative physical health outcomes are something that can be passed on. Shoot.
Just out of curiosity,
Mhm.
were people able to control against the, simply being raised in a low functioning household, I imagine increases these problems, even from a specific trauma response?
So there's different study designs that they can use to try to control for that. One is that you can take a typical American family and compare to a family that has a like veteran father, a Holocaust surviving father, or something like that. That can point to these patterns. The better way to control it is taking whole groups of veterans or survivors and trying to give some of that group therapy and see how their family is doing, and give the other group just observational time that's not therapy and see how their family is doing. The therapy does seem to make a difference. So it does seem to be something related to a parent's own trauma that is affecting their relationship with their family. But it's complicated. Then the study designs are a little messy sometimes. Yeah.
It could be true of any family, you know, there's
Mhm.
dysfunctional families everywhere, and they may or may not
Exactly.
have, so if you may have given the same kind of surface to those dysfunctional children, it may have been happened the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to distinguish if it's the trauma, or these are the types of people
Yeah.
that can't function well in any situation.
You're exactly right, and that's part of the limitation of this kind of research, is that the dysfunction that can come from being a trauma survivor and how you interact with your family is really hard to tease apart from other just general mental illness and stuff. Unfortunately, I don't have a solution for you. It's kind of just something that we have to take on as we study this, that there's that uncertainty there. I saw a hand back here.
Yeah, do you attempt to intervene between the trauma and establishment of the family?
It depends. I would say that it's best practice, if you know that someone has experienced a trauma, to try to provide that person treatment. The problem is that life moves faster than mental health systems can move. In particular, for some of the groups that we're talking about today, Holocaust survivors, 9/11 survivors, the descendants of African American slaves, etc. Those systems either didn't exist or couldn't possibly move fast enough to try to cover the trauma. So thank you all for your questions. I appreciate it. Moving on to talk about the routes of transmission. Hopefully this can try to illustrate some of the ways that those symptoms get passed on, which will include, like you said, the biological element, and it'll also get into some of these larger questions about how families function and how social groups function. So starting off, there's two types of transmission. There's direct and indirect. Direct transmission is going to be the stuff that's like a parent directly passes an effect of trauma to their child. And we're going to talk about that first. The most basic version of this is epigenetics. This is a super direct connection where we see that trauma changes the DNA that is in our bodies. We literally change our genetic code when we experience a negative event. And then it causes our genes to change. It changes the way that our bodies function, and in some cases can even create mutations that cause disease. Then the problem is that that doesn't just stay in us, that gets passed to children. And the way that it gets passed to children can vary, but if a child experiences a trauma, then all of their sex cells, their eggs or sperm, are going to have that changed DNA. If it happens as an adult, the genetic stock of eggs in ovaries is pretty set, but sperm are constantly regenerated by biologically male people. So the genes of a traumatized individual can still re-enter the gene pool generation after generation. Yes,
Give an example of a trauma that changes one's.
absolutely.
Other than a radiological.
Yeah. So this is actually something that I was studying personally at Mount Hope Family Center, which is run out of the University of Rochester. We would follow adults that we knew were maltreated as children because we knew that we could track the genetic changes that happened as a result of sexual maltreatment, and we could see in those people that there were changes to their reproductive health and functioning. And then we brought in their children, and we could see that there were signs of that change in children as well. In particular, the kinds of changes that we were observing were increased pain during pregnancy and birth, increased rate of miscarriage, things like that. And things that seem unrelated to any social function. The rate of miscarriage is probably not associated with your social capacity as much as it's related to biological factors inside oneself. Any other questions about this before I move on to the next type of direct transmission? All right. So moving on to the next type of direct transmission, poor parenting, which is something we've talked about a little bit already. We know that trauma changes the way that parents are thinking. And sometimes it can make a person into just a straight up negative parent. But I actually want to talk about things that parents think are helpful, but might be harming their child. I'm not trying to place blame on parents here, but a parent who's experienced a trauma may be detached or silent around that kind of experience. They may not want to experience it again or think about that experience, so they choose to remove themselves from such a situation, which can lead to children that don't feel as attached. If you, as a child, were constantly getting yelled at about being late to school, you might say, I don't ever want to yell at my kid like that. I'm just not going to drive them to school myself to avoid it. But unfortunately, your kid doesn't know that. Your kid just knows, Dad never drives me to school. On top of that, parents can be very controlling to try to avoid their children getting hurt, which can lead to, again, that power struggle and an insecurely attached child. And parents can over-disclose. They can talk too much about the trauma that they experienced and trying to educate their kid. But unfortunately, the back result of that is that if you say too much to a child who's too young, those stories can be traumatizing in themselves. And ultimately, the outcomes that we see in children who experience this type of traumatized poor parenting is that they learn to be extremely shameful and extremely guilty about minor things. So I'd like to illustrate a point with this in mind, that trauma transference, like you said earlier, is re-traumatization a lot of the time. It's not just this direct passage of a trauma response, but it is that new traumas can crop up that continue to keep successive generations feeling a trauma response over and over again. And I'd like to illustrate that with something out of the Tanakh. We're all Jews here, many of us are Jews here, so I want to try to discuss something in a Jewish text that can illustrate this. So to start off, does anyone here have a guess as to what event is being depicted in this painting?
It's in the bottom.
Yeah. No, I know it's in the bottom. That's the title of the painting, but do you know the historical event that's being depicted?
Yeah, they're leaving Egypt and going to Sinai.
See, you'd think so,
Yeah.
which is why I put the title up, because I think that it's a terribly titled painting. This is the Israelites leaving Israel during the Babylonian captivity. So this is when Babylon comes in, they take over the kingdom of Judah, and they force out many of the Israelites who live there and force them to resettle in Babylon. The reason that I picked this instead of the Exodus is that this is the first Jewish trauma that has archaeological evidence. We have cuneiform tablets that show that King Nebuchadnezzar had invaded the kingdom of Judah. So we know that this is something that happened, and we can track what Jews were saying about it because we also have biblical text from the time. So this is a quote from Jeremiah. I'm just going to read it out loud so that everyone on Zoom is able to process it as well. But I want you to think about what type of parenting, essentially, we're seeing from God in this passage. Thus says the Lord, because you have not obeyed my words, I am going to send for Babylon, and I will bring them against this land. I will utterly destroy Israel and make them an object of horror and of hissing and an everlasting disgrace. The key thing to notice here is just how retributive God is being. The Jews made a mistake, and so they're going to be punished for it, and their children's children are going to be punished for it. About 2 generations later, their children's children are coming back to Israel after Persia defeats Babylon and Persia lets the Jews return home. At the time, we have these leaders like Ezra, who has his own book, that are contending with the changed state of Judaism. And here's a quote from Ezra that I think illustrates the second part of the re-traumatization process. Oh my God, I am too ashamed and mortified to lift my face to you. Oh my God, for our iniquities are overwhelming and our guilt has grown high as heaven. So, even in the Tanakh, even while we're looking at...
Come on up.
Is that on Zoom?
Someone from Zoom was interjecting.
Any thoughts from Zoom?
I think it may have been an
It might have been an accident. Okay.
Sorry.
So what I'd like us to focus on here is we see that retributive justice element of God in Jeremiah. 2 generations later, we're still seeing the Jews coping with this guilt of issues that they created, that they were punished for. They're expecting more punishment. But I don't know if we necessarily see that as the arc of history changes, that God continues to dole out punishment. Any questions about this? Yes.
I've always thought that one of the things that's clear that separates Judaism from other religions is that, you know, such an original sin.
Mm-hmm.
And that we have this, you know, weight on our shoulders for that. But in a different way, through, you know, transference or you know, hereditary, you know, sharing, isn't this sort of similar to that?
Yeah,
You know, forevermore, generation by generation, more carry
I agree with you. I think that the ethos of Judaism is that it doesn't believe in original sin per se. However, biblical Judaism, while not believing in original sin, tends to be pretty clear that you can sin and you will get punished. So even though there's not this ancient sin that we're constantly making up for, there does seem to be a cycle of sin, punishment, retribution that characterizes a lot of the Tanakh. And it changes over the course of the Tanakh to become less retributive. I saw another hand from over here. Yes.
You're talking about Jeremiah and Ezra, or prophets. This isn't the Torah. These are their opinions written. Okay, even though we thrived in Babylon and we had lots of things coming out of Babylon. And if we go back, because I'm getting confused by this, I'm a generation, as most of the people here, of people who lived through pogroms in Europe, very poor, okay, and then lived through the First World War, where they starved, etc., and then lived through the Second World War. And parents who were born during the Depression, okay, and many of us had not good parents, so to speak. Yet we get thrived as a people in this country. We produce doctors, lawyers, scientists, political leaders. So what percent of us are damaged by all of this trauma over the generations they're supposed to pass down?
That's a good question.
This is an explanation for those who are damaged, that we should forgive them because they've been damaged by prior generations.
There
Okay,
are
so-
damaged doctors.
So there's two questions here. In terms of the number of us that are affected by intergenerational trauma, I don't have an exact percentage for you, I'm sorry. I would say that it's not that intergenerational trauma prevents us from being successful, but it is an obstacle for groups to have to consider and overcome as they seek out an opportunity to succeed. And my use of these quotes from the Tanakh is not necessarily to say that Jews today are still coping with the effect of the Babylonian captivity, but rather that the processes that I'm talking about are not modern contractions, but they are a characteristic of being a member of a traumatized group. Yes, right.
I remember now
Mhm.
why I asked you to come in this particular week. And it escaped me. You know, we had a rough beginning, so so it kind of escaped me. The reason why I wanted you, James, to come this week is because this Torah portion is Vayera, where we read the story of the Akedah,
Mhm.
where Abraham decides that he needs to kill his son on the altar. And then at the last moment changes his mind, but yet, you know, for quite possibly creating a trauma in his son Isaac. So from the very, and it's not just me saying it,
Yeah.
it's a lot of midrashim and a lot of Jewish texts, and even the Bible can allude to it in some ways, the Torah. So from the very beginning, in other words, the first Jewish parents, Abraham and Sarah, have caused trauma that is also even theologically related
Mhm.
to their son Isaac.
Well,
So-
Sarah had a hand in that. That was mostly Abraham.
I'm trying to be egalitarian. No, I'm just trying to be egalitarian. But yes, well, he may have played a bit of more of an active part, so let's give her some slack. That's correct. In fact, they said that she died because of that. So I don't want to take over. I just want to put it into context. That when I thought, oh, how can we address Vayera?
Mhm.
I sat there and we said, oh, and Hannah said, I have a friend who deals with that. So
Yeah.
So it's just to put it in that context. Yeah.
And I don't want to, again, I don't want to derail. I'd like to keep moving on, but thinking about the Akedah and the binding of Isaac, like, let's remember that I don't think that Isaac is by any means a purposefully abusive parent, but he sees his half brother get sent off into the desert, and then he himself is almost killed by his father. The next portion, when we see Isaac with his sons, he says, all right, I'm just going to play by the rules. My birthright is my birthright, and it only goes to my firstborn son. We don't necessarily see that as the best decision he could have made based on the characteristics of Esau, but he's working with the information that he has to try to be a good parent. So I want to move on to indirect transmission, which is the next half of it. Direct transmission, parent to kid to kid. Indirect transmission is a little bit more about the systems that we live in and how they can re-traumatize us. So, poor communication, like we talked about, is something that can be transferred directly. You grow up in a house that doesn't communicate, you don't learn how to communicate effectively. But once you're a poor communicator, what happens to you? You get excluded. And when you get excluded, you get angry at the world around you. If you take out that anger, everyone says, wow, what an angry guy, and they exclude you. So it has this spiral of social exclusion and aggression, which can continue to re-traumatize. So even a tiny drop of poor communication can be something that leads to this re-traumatization cycle. And the reason that I'm using Jamie Lee Curtis's character in Everything Everywhere All at Once to illustrate this, I don't think she's a bad person, but when you are a tax clerk, you spend your entire life telling people that they owe you money and that they did their paperwork poorly. She's in a bad mood because no one ever treats her with grace. I don't think that she is necessarily an example of intergenerational trauma, but this is the kind of cycle that I'm trying to illustrate. And this is something that can happen generation after generation after generation. And then, if we can think about it within a social group as social groups being re-traumatizing or potentially forces being re-traumatizing, then we should also think about it systemically, not just within a social group, but within a society, that the system can continue to traumatize people, which is transmission that happens without parent input. Let's say you're an incredibly resilient parent, you experience a trauma, you raise a child as perfectly as you can, you follow all of the scientific literature on how to raise a perfect kid, and then you let them out into the world, and the world says, oh, you're a Native American? Well, you're gonna have to jump through all these hoops so that you can go to college. It's not the parents' fault, it's the system's fault that they weren't able to succeed. And the reason that I'm using this specific ad, the sort of pollution crying Indian ad, to illustrate this is because there's also a social self-fulfilling prophecy that if a group only ever gets depicted one way, and that one way is a trauma response, that's the only way that people ever grow up seeing themselves. Another example of this might be Black Americans only ever seeing themselves as violent in media. There's a social expectation that a group is going to act a certain way, and the only reason that that social expectation exists is because it's a trauma response to trauma that the system already inculcated. Any questions about this? All right. So I'm going to move on to talking about another period where we see transmission of trauma in Jewish history. Does anyone know where this location is? It's in Israel.
Isn't that a snake path?
Yeah. So what does the snake path lead up to? Masada. Yep. So Masada is a fortress slash castle that got turned into a fortress from the Roman Jewish War. Little bit of historical context for that. The Romans were in charge of a land that they called Palestine for about a century prior to that. They start a war in part because of revolutionary thinkers like members of the Jesus movement. Over 1.5 million Jews die. That's a conservative estimate. Then many more Jews are displaced from Israel and sent about throughout the Roman Empire. And then the Romans remain rulers over the Jews for an additional 4 centuries. So, with that historical context in mind, I just want to track one group of Jews that was written about by Josephus, who is a Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience. And he writes about these Jews of Perea. And I'm not going to read the whole quote, you can feel free to read it yourself. But in short, the Jews originally from Perea were moved throughout the Roman Empire. They tried to settle in Philadelphia and were not granted the option to settle there. There was a violent rebellion, and the Romans responded in kind. Now you may be thinking, okay, violence was met with violence. That seems like a pretty normal eye for an eye trade for the ancient world. Except the problem is that the Jews of Perea were a peaceful group that were displaced and forced to live elsewhere. And when they were told by Romans that they couldn't live there in other parts of Rome, like the city of Philadelphia, not Pennsylvania, modern day Greece, they were told that they couldn't live in that town. They said, we've been traveling around for years. We have not been able to settle. How can you deny us an opportunity to stay in a place? This is that systematic re-traumatization. The Roman system is not set up in a way that is allowing the Jews the right to basic needs like shelter. So there is an uprising, a trauma response, a violent, inappropriate reaction that gets quashed. And if you read further in Josephus, you're going to see this group, the Jews from Perea, do it again and again because they keep not being able to settle. So this is a systematic re-traumatization of these Jews. Now I want to move on to a discussion portion here. We've got, I believe, yeah, we've got some time. I've got some handouts here that I'm going to give to the room. On the front of it is a quick 1-page dossier about a modern group of people that has gone through a trauma and how that trauma is being transferred from generation to generation. I've got some questions on the back, which I'm going to show you up here on the board as well, for you to think about with your neighbor or your group. So the questions are, what trauma did they experience, which is going to be pretty noticeable from the start? describe one route of transmission in a single sentence. So there's a couple different routes of transmission in each of these, but I want you to try to think of one and describe it succinctly. And then describe whether or not this transmission is direct or indirect. Remember, direct, parent to child, indirect, the system is re-traumatizing. And then finally, how do you think this could be addressed? How are we going to heal the people that are harmed by this trauma? So I've got these 3 dossiers here, and I'm just going to hand them out to like 1/3 of the, please, yeah, to like 1/3 of the room each. So the third to my right, I'm going to hand you the packet about children of Holocaust survivors. So if you can kind of distribute that amongst this chunk of the room. And then on my left is going to be about Native Americans, and then here in the center is about descendants of the Atlantic slave trade. So I'm going to distribute that. You guys will get an opportunity to read through it. We're going to come back together in, I'm going to say 7 minutes, maybe a little bit less, to discuss.
This is great, great.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, I apologize again for shaking production of this. This is wonderful. By the way, I believe that this Philadelphia is which is a capital sense geographically.
I couldn't get a good sense from reading the Josephus about which Philadelphia it was. There's also one that's in Turkey.
Okay.
As I was looking through it, the mentions seemed to be referring to sea travel. So I kind of assumed that it was the big one, but it might be the one that's modern day. Yeah, there's also Philadelphia and Egypt, but not at this time.
So it may have been Greece. Okay, so my bad.
I don't know which one it is. I'm
I'll look
kind of
at
guessing.
I look at it.
Yeah. Yes.
And I would bring groups to that.
Mm.
Boxing around, what we could do. You see, put some of the unions over the roads, because I look at those things. And then after that, the rest would actually done.
Interesting.
So that's, I think it's a lot of it to do with Masada. And the archaeologists.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what we've taken in the sun.
Oh, wow.
That's absolutely reveals a. Gap to.
Yes, I mean, if we look at like Josephus's inspiration in like Herodotus, they're storytellers more than they're accurate historians. So it's possible that for the sake of to sell his argument to a Roman audience, as he's saying, like, all the stuff that happened locally is real, it's interesting, but if I sell it as happening throughout the Roman Empire, then it's gonna sell me, it's gonna give me a little bit more credence as a well-traveled man. Yeah, I mean, so I had effectively 1 year, it was divvied up over my college experience, but effectively 1 full credit worth of education. But so that was sort of. Yeah, I mean, so, I took and stuff, but then past that, research. Yeah, it's just really fascinating to me. No, it's fine. Warning, you're not raised in it. The professor, so he was here for a year. And then he got a tenure track position. I grew up in Colorado. I appreciate it. I'm gonna go bounce around. That's okay. Listen to people's conversations. I appreciate it.
Actually, I think we have, like, yeah, we had a lot of fun. I don't, especially with younger, all those stories that. Right. Sixth grade. Oh, well. And
All right, folks, I'm gonna give you one more minute to kind of close up your conversations and we'll come back together in 60 seconds. I wanna be sensitive of your time. There's a Bills game to go watch.
That's not until later today, come on.
But you gotta make your like 7-layer dip and stuff.
alcohol, Russian. Hops.
Yeah.
Not gonna help.
Yeah.
Just how the first year happened. And I think you have to.
This is right. Bro. You know? Well on it, and we can chat at it. Okay.
I don't think.
I didn't grow up in the house that had
We can chat more about it in the one presentation, but I like where your head's at. All right, folks, let's finish our conversations. And I want to dive into a group discussion about this. All three of these groups, we should have at least a little bit of passing familiarity with. I want to start off by asking the people who read the dossier on Holocaust survivors to share with us, I mean, we know what trauma they experienced, but share with us some thoughts on the route of transmission. Shoot.
One route of transmission that we came up with was actually teaching of the Holocaust in schools.
Mm-hmm.
And if handled poorly, can become a re-traumatization.
Absolutely, yeah.
We called it indirect because it's definitely not. It's not only the internal community and parent to child. This is a, it's just more or less a system-wide thing. Apparently some places don't teach about the Holocaust. And as far as addressing it, just working on age appropriate stuff. I wasn't part of this group, but I know there is a sizable group in this temple that came from another temple over disagreements about how the Holocaust was being taught in their school and the age appropriateness of some of that stuff.
Any other thoughts about routes of transmission from Holocaust survivors to their children?
Well, there's certainly also, the suggestion of a direct transmission biologically,
Yes.
and, so I don't know how you treat that.
Yeah, that's harder to treat. For those of you who didn't have this document, one of the things that's in it is that it talks about heart disease and coronary issues is something that are common in Holocaust survivors and that may be getting passed on. It's hard to tell. We're so close to the Holocaust historically that it's hard to see whether or not that's getting passed on.
So that begs the question, and so let's say you can break the spell of the indirect.
Mhm.
Would that then also improve the direct?
Um,
In subsequent generations.
So it can.
Yeah.
Generally, like, we know that good mental health helps support good physical health. But we also need to think about wider things about healthcare access and stuff like that. It's more systematic, you know? Jumping ahead to those of us who had the dossier on formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants, what kinds of routes of transmission are we seeing affecting Black Americans today?
Direct and indirect.
Can you elaborate on both?
Well, direct would be, genetically, and indirect is just that, there are so many of our systems that exclude them or make it difficult for them.
Mhm.
When you talk about healthcare, and we were talking about the racism that most whites have been taught as we grow up, which then affects how they treat people of color, doctors treating their Black patients differently than their white patients. It just, and everything in business, and everything, it just goes on and on.
Absolutely, yeah. For those of you who are trying to track the pattern in the conversation, we're seeing that big systematic things like healthcare access, like media representation, things like that, are really something for us to consider about how we address intergenerational trauma. We've only got 2 data points though, so 3 makes a pattern. Those of us who had the dossier for Native American survivors of residential schools, can you share, this one I think might be a little bit more niche, so can you actually share a little bit about what traumas were experienced as well as the transference?
Starvation.
Starvation? Mm-hmm.
They were taken away from their families,
Yes.
put into residential schools.
Mm-hmm.
Language.
Traditions and language.
Yes, yeah, they were forced to act as if they were white Americans or white Canadians.
Humiliation and shame.
Mm-hmm.
Sexual abuse.
Sexual abuse.
What effect did natural selection have on this? We're talking about people who are generations in cold climate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that affects genetically who survives as you go through the generations. So I agree with everything said, but was a study done on natural selection as to the population in general, as to whether they all gained weight because of natural selection and genetic changes over the course of thousands of years.
I think that so you're alluding here to one of the direct like biological forms of transmission of this trauma that gets discussed in the dossier, that there were Native Americans in these schools who were starved. Their genetics changed in such a way to allow them to withstand starvation. But when that's then passed on to successive generations with more equitable access to food, increased insulin sensitivity and increased adiposity are biological changes that help us survive starvation and also make us obese when we have access to food, right? So that's like what you're alluding to?
Yeah.
No, I think what we're getting at is natural selection were people who died because of starvation, didn't make it to the next generation.
No, I understand what you're saying, but just for those of us who didn't read the packet, just so they know that we're thinking about obesity and starvation on like kind of a biological connected spectrum. In terms of natural selection, I don't know. Well, so being selected within the residential school, I wouldn't describe as natural. I would describe that as an artificial selection.
Well, yeah, of course.
In terms of the culture of Native Americans throughout Canada and whether or not they were already biologically programmed to experience those things,
Yes.
they may have been. Living in cold climates changes the way that they have access to food, their relationship with food and weight, and it's storing fat. However, studies that are cited here are not just comparing white Canadians to residential school survivors. They're comparing Native Americans who did not go to residential schools to Native American families that were sent to residential schools. So the increased rates of obesity that we see in children of residential school survivors is still a change that was being brought about by the traumas in residential schools. You can control for it by looking at populations that did not experience this trauma, and those studies do take into account those controls. Yes.
Well, would you think it's in all three instances, people who experience starvation, okay, over a period of their lives, okay, end up when there's now plenty of food, seem to be always obsessed with food in terms of the fact that they may not have it or something. So they tend to have much more of an obsession, I think, over food than people who have not been starved for a period of time. So I don't know if you study in terms of that, but starvation alone could cause obsession over food, which then could cause obesity, etc.
I see where you're coming from. I can't think of any studies that I read that try to unlink the psychological preoccupation with food with the genetic food response. However, the studies that I did read are using gene analysis. They're looking at methylated DNA to find what has been changed in these genes. It's not just a pattern of adiposity, it is the genes that relate to adiposity that are different.
What
Yes.
about the trauma that all these groups have seen by losing their heritage?
Yes, so I want to move to where your head's at in terms of the themes between these three groups. There's two big ones. They're losing their heritage, which has a huge effect on their psychological well-being. And all three of these are discussing, to a certain extent, systematic issues with treatment. It's not just an issue that causes the trauma, but it's also an issue with how they have access to addressing the intergenerational trauma.
I just wanted to comment on how excellent these three pieces.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. So moving into talking about how we address intergenerational trauma. And I'm going to let you know right off the bat that I don't think we do a great job with it right now. Most of the work that is going on has to do with awareness, which you can see. When I asked you guys, what is intergenerational trauma? I got 3 different and all correct answers. So the awareness work is doing a great job, but being aware does not wellness make. Mostly what we do right now for people who are experiencing intergenerational trauma is on a person-by-person basis. An individual can say that they are having a trauma response to something that they did not experience, and they can seek out therapy. And they can get therapy, and it's kind of like they're treating PTSD, but it has limited effects. PTSD is meant to PTSD treatment is meant to deal with thoughts about events that happened to us, flashbacks that we're having about something we remember. It's harder to address the larger systemic changes that are brought about by intergenerational trauma simply through psychotherapy.
And the biological change.
And the biological changes, we can't do anything about that right now. Exactly. Moving forwards, thinking about the far-flung future, where hopefully intergenerational trauma is something that we can treat and address person by person, but also community by community, I think we need to start thinking about the socio-ecological model. So this is something that you might be familiar with. It was developed by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who was a Russian immigrant. He's Jewish, and he was a Cornell psychologist. So upstate New York research represent. And he created this system called the socio-ecological model, which is based off of him seeing developmental influences from across his experience growing up in the Soviet Union. And the way that it basically works is saying that the individual is the one who experiences change, or the one who experiences a trauma, or the one who experiences the trauma response. However, all of these different systems that they're in play a part in the person's development and their movement towards holistic wellness. If the person goes to therapy and they address the mental health issues that are a result of their intergenerational trauma that they're experiencing, the individual layer might be healed, but then if they have a heart issue as a genetic result of their intergenerational trauma and they don't have health insurance, they won't be able to treat it. So you need to think about the nested systems that people exist within, which is easier said than done, but I'm going to say it right now and then we can think about how to do it. Starting at the bottom and moving our way up, individual treatments are really difficult. This is a huge gap in research right now. We know that genetic research is working on pointing out the exact genes that are being changed by what traumas, which eventually lays the groundwork for us to do genetic therapy to try to make people better. That's science fiction right now. We're not there yet. The hope is there, the research is working towards it, but we have to start thinking bigger so that we can try to change individual health. And the next step of that is going to be interpersonal changes. Like I said, modern day, if you are experiencing the symptoms of intergenerational trauma, you can go to a therapist and get individual psychotherapy. But what we need to start changing is the way that we think about family systems as they're changed by intergenerational trauma. So attachment-based family therapy is a type of family therapy that focuses on everyone who is in a family unit having healthy functioning with each other and trusting each other. There's been limited research on this in the context of intergenerational trauma, but unlike the research on individual therapy, this stuff works better than a placebo. So this is the promise of interpersonal change for intergenerational trauma. Moving up to an institution, so now we're talking about a single hospital system, a single health insurance company, a single school. We can change access to therapy and we can keep working on the awareness work. This, again, easier said than done, but there's work going on right now to try to increase access to healthcare. It's slow going and it's very hard, but this is what we work on. Moving up to the community level, we need to also start thinking about large interconnected bodies of institutions that are all trying to coordinate efforts towards holistic health. This is my job. This is what the community schools model does, where it takes a school district and it tries to say, all right, here are the doctors who work with the kids who are in our district. Here are the food pantries that work with the families in our district. Let's have them all communicate with each other and use the school district as a central hub so that people have access to healthcare, food, rent money, clothing, etc., etc. It's a hard task and the work is never done. But this is one system among many that can change a community's focus from individuals who live near each other to a group of people who mutually support each other. And then finally, moving up to a political level, the whole system of the laws in the country that we live in, barring some kind of unprecedented upheaval, the best way that we can change it is through lobbying and research. We have basic research that happens right now that used to be funded by the government and is now primarily funded through private sources. That research goes back to lobbyists in Washington or in your local state government, which tries to change the systems that are currently traumatizing people. One such example is we're working now on basic research about how Black Americans experience police brutality. Because once we have the data about how police brutality affects people, we can more effectively make a case to change a policing system. Does that sound like it's going to take 30 years? Yes. Are we in year 10 of that? Yeah, we're going to keep working on it. It's an end goal, but we're going to keep working towards changing the system. Questions or thoughts on the socio-ecological model, moving towards holistic wellness? Okay, so before we move on to my suggestion for what to do right now, I want us to also just be aware that the socio-ecological model thinks a lot about solving problems for people. But the problem is, if you pop your tire on the side of the road, and then someone comes in, changes the tire for you, and speeds off, sure, that helps you out, but you didn't get a skill from it. You don't know how to change a tire now. So solving a problem for someone is fine, but solving a problem with someone is going to continue to make people better. Sort of a give a man a fish versus teach a man a fish. However, in order to achieve that, we need to become aware of the lived experiences of the oppressed. We cannot help people, we cannot work with people if we don't actually work with people. So, I'm going to give us a Jewish approach on what we can do right now to try to make things better and how we can support this massive systematic change. And I'm going to do this by using a Talmud story. I'll explain the picture in a second. I know it's a scary picture to use to talk about Talmud. But there's a story from Tractate Yoma that says, not in so many words, there was a man who lived in a Jewish community, and for work or for personal reasons, he had to travel a great distance. And as a result of that, he had to stay in a Gentile populated city on Shabbat. And again, this is during Talmudic times. Gentiles and Jews did not live together, and Jews observed the Shabbat very conservatively. So he's staying in this town over Shabbat, and he hears a crash outside. And he runs outside and he sees that a building has collapsed and there are people inside the building who are trapped. But the problem is, it's Shabbat, he's Jewish, he's in a city that is not his own city, and he's outside an Eruv, so he's not allowed to lift stuff. So what does he do? He goes back to Israel and asks rabbis questions. And here are the questions that he asked. He says, the question that I just sort of made clear, do I have to break Shabbat to save the people in this building? And the rabbis respond, yeah, you gotta do that, man. You shouldn't have left them. And so he says, okay, sure, but they're probably all Gentiles. Do I still have to save them, even if they're not Jews?
Yeah.
Yes, you gotta save people that are hurting. And then he says, okay, so the building's collapsed. I just see rubble. People might be trapped, but how do I know if the people that are there are already dead? I don't want to waste effort on Shabbat trying to save someone who doesn't need saving. And the rabbis say, you have to dig them up until you reveal their face or their heart. You have to see if they're breathing or if their heart is still beating to know if they're worth saving. And the man says, but at that point, if they're alive, I've already done all the heavy lifting for them. Why must I do all the heavy lifting for them if they're the ones who are alive and should be able to do it themselves? And I would say, that's so bad. So here's my suggestion to you based off of this Talmud story. That first off, there's an assumption that's made in this story that the man who's seeing this is an able-bodied person. First off, before we can help treat intergenerational trauma in other people and provide them support, we have to make sure that we are able to do it. We have to do the hard work of making sure that we're healthy and capable of helping other people. And I don't just mean physically able, but I mean mentally able. If you don't have the spoons, to use like disability language talk, or if you don't have the mental capacity, using sort of psychological talk, to help someone, don't try to help them because you're just going to stress yourself out. But once you can help them, once you're able to do that, then you need to make a face-to-face and a heart-to-heart connection with the people that you are trying to work with. Not only is this going to actually give you an in to helping people because you've met them and you've formed a relationship with them, it's the first step in becoming culturally competent. I heard from over here from the woman in the blue flannel, something about us being white Jews in this room, but I mean, if I look around, there are no people of color here. There's one person of color here, sorry. But for the most part, we as a room are not people of color. So if we're going to be working closely with communities of color, we need to actually have a connection with them. We can't just show up and do work for them and say, all right, you better thank us. We have to make a face-to-face and a heart-to-heart connection, not only to have an in with who we're trying to work with, but to be culturally competent with the people that we're trying to work with. And then we can do the part of addressing trauma that we can. We can start lifting stones off of people. We can start rebuilding the building. We can do whatever we have to do to that collapsed building to help, because our assistance might just be the thing that allows the people that we're working with to lift themselves up. And once they've been lifted up, they themselves can join us in the cycle and start their own face-to-face and heart-to-heart connection with someone who's struggling. Thank you very much for your time. I've got
About a couple of minutes, not too many actually, maybe
Yeah, not-
four.
not too many. I can take a couple of questions, but my email's up here. So if you've got something that you want to talk about, write it down, email me. I will respond to you as soon as I can. Yes, in the back.
I worked for a Jewish organization, and I used to tell people that one of the things I was most proud of working for that organization, and I stopped telling people because of the response I got. One of the reasons I was most proud of working for that particular organization is they had this sort of quiet policy that the only topic they didn't cover in all of their offerings was the Holocaust. And it was because that's everywhere, it was a Jewish community, like that's covered everywhere. It's the one thing, it's sort of the go-to that in high school or whatever, speaking of trauma, that's when Jews are mentioned. And they wanted to remind everybody that we have such a rich and historic story in addition to that. But anytime I told people that I was really proud of them for having hundreds of different programs and not doing something on the Holocaust, people got very offended. Jews got offended when I told them that. So I stopped telling them that. But it was something I was proud of that organization for doing. So it was interesting to me in the context of talking about trauma, that sometimes our trauma is so much a part of our identity that we don't want to let go necessarily. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I sort of see both sides of that you want a Jewish organization that doesn't only focus on the Holocaust. You also, as a Jew, want to hear about the Holocaust because that's part of our cultural identity. In terms of thinking about trauma, my main thought on it is you can not talk about the Holocaust as long as you are understanding that people's background is extending out of the Holocaust. There's no Jew on the planet who doesn't have some thread back to the Holocaust. And so we can move on, we can be forward thinking, we can do good work without talking about the Holocaust, and we do good work without talking about the Holocaust. But we also just need to understand, for the sake of like cultural competence, that's where Jews are coming from a lot of the time. Yeah, we're over here.
So I wonder how far back things can be considered intergenerational trauma from 2 points of view. So there are global traumas like COVID, like the plague, and if something becomes so ubiquitous or nearly ubiquitous, is that, how do you research that? And also the traumas.
I don't know.
Yeah, the traumas that women experience, because pretty much every single generation of women have been traumatized in some way, whether directly or just, indirectly. I'm wondering if there's any research also on the gender component of things.
So there is research on the gender component of things. However, I think that your two questions are linked because researching something that's ubiquitous is nearly impossible. Trying to create a control group when everyone on the planet is in your experimental group makes it impossible to make a real scientific study.
Yeah.
So you can look for patterns, but ubiquity makes trauma less particular. And the same is true of trying to research women's issues from an intergenerational trauma lens. It's possible. We can think about how mothers parent their daughters. We can think about how women pass on to women their reproductive characteristics, which, like I said from my own research, are changed by sexual maltreatment that women experience regularly. But the intergenerational trauma lens mostly helps us think about the ways in which those issues are really big and systemic, which means that we then need to go back to sort of thinking about systems to try to solve those things. The reason that this was a secret presentation on the socio-ecological theory is because I think that they're pretty entangled, and the more ubiquitous a trauma is, or the more that an entire group is affected by a trauma, the more that it becomes a socio-ecological matter than it becomes an intergenerational trauma matter. Does that make sense? Okay, so last question, and then again, please email me if you have any other thoughts. I'm happy to respond.
I just noticed your email at Peaceful Schools.
Yes.
Does that represent an organization?
Yes, it does. So this is my work email. I know that I said that my work is housed in East Irondequoit Central School District, which it is. But I am a contractor for them through the company Peaceful Schools, which is a community-based organization that is housed in Syracuse and Rochester. And the work that it does is basically putting people like myself in school districts so that we can help students and help the community in that school district, while also having access to the resources of a larger statewide community-based organization. So it's a kind of best of both worlds thing. But yeah, Peaceful Schools is the company that I work for, and they're like a local women-owned.
I will apologize to the people who still have questions. This is great. If you are past the time and we're left with a taste for more, that means that you've really intrigued and engaged our community. I'm hoping that we'll get another chance to get to hear from you.
Yeah.
Since I think you have shown much, we can benefit so much from it. And thank you very much for coming.
Of course.
And thank you all for coming. Yeah, I just want to say, yes, me too. I just don't have the capacity to do it physically. And to say that at 11 a.m., the Social Action Committee, and after the Bagel today, I believe it's repro activity. You want to say a word about that?
Please say.
Yeah.
Educational piece, and we're gonna put together our repro care bag assembly.
And this is happening where? Here? Right here. Very good. Next week at Hall of the Bagel, the 3 times a citizen, American Jewish, and a veteran with our very own Gary Ginsberg, which will be fascinating as well. And not unrelated to your, maybe perhaps unrelated to at least some of that, what you said. Everybody, this Friday, November 7th, we're hosting the El Shaddai Church members, many of whom are immigrants from Africa who have been through traumas themselves. And we're very happy to be in contact with them. We also get their yummy food, so you should come and be with us. So take care, guys.
And regarding the repro bags and stuff, if you want to get a taste of using a community-based helping someone through trauma, start with the repro bags and move on from there. This is a good entry point.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zoom folks. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This was fabulous.